I'm getting ready to move, providing our first house purchase goes through smoothly, so videos will be hard to get out for a few weeks, but I'm endeavoring to finish a few more videos first. Today we're looking at Far Cry 5 on the Xbox One X and the Potato Masher Pro. Now, I know why a lot of you are here. Multiple outlets have reported that a GTX 1060 or RX 580 can't match the Xbox One X at native 4K, and that's true. I don't believe in intentional clickbait, so I won't drag that out. However, the differences and similarities between the two platforms are a lot more interesting than just what resolution they're running at, so I encourage you to keep watching if you're curious. If you don't know, the Potato Masher Pro is a $450 PC featuring a GTX 1060 and a Xeon 3440. I compare it to the Xbox One X to show you how you can have a great high-resolution gaming experience even on a console budget. Let's get to it. Far Cry 5 is a bit of a rare game in the sense that it's a sequel that's released in the same console generation as a few previous games in the series, on the same engine, and without any massive changes being made in regards to underlying technology. That's glossing over all the many refinements and improvements that the Dunia engine has received, and I'm not at all discounting the insane amount of work it takes to make a game, even if it's a sequel. I only mean that Ubisoft made, in my opinion, a smart decision by building on the mature underpinnings of Far Cry 4 and Far Cry Primal. The result is a game that genuinely looks good on most combinations of settings and runs well enough that a wide range of consumers should be able to enjoy it. Most games have a few visual settings that account for most of the performance difference between the different available graphical presets, like the grass settings in GTA 5 or the shadows in Ghost Recon Wildlands. Common heavy hitters are shadows, lighting, and ambient occlusion in most games, which won't be a surprise to anyone who watches this series. Resolution also makes a large difference, of course, but in most games it's a predictably linear increase in both quality and compute requirements. Far Cry 5 is quite a bit different, and that leads to a very interesting difference between the Potato Masher Pro and Xbox One X. The first thing that's rare about Far Cry 5 is that the different graphical presets don't affect performance or the visuals as much as you might think. I ran the in-game benchmark at native 4K at each preset, and here's the results for average frame rate and 1% lows at native 4K. You can see that the game would be mostly playable at 4K in low settings, so the Masher Pro can technically handle native 4K, but just barely. You'll also notice a fairly linear decrease in frame rate as the settings increase, and of course that's also fairly normal. Here's where it gets interesting. Dropping the resolution scaling to 80%, which we'll talk more about in a minute, you'd expect to see a roughly 15 to 25% increase in frame rate. That means that at low settings, instead of an average frame rate of 35, you might see 40 to 45 FPS. You really wouldn't expect to see an average of 49 FPS at low settings, which is what I saw. That's not a fluke either. You can see the huge change in frame rate across the board, and high and ultra settings are even including temporal anti-aliasing at both resolutions. This is very unusual, and it makes it even more interesting that Ubisoft targeted native 4K on the Xbox One X, given that reducing the resolution just slightly provides such huge performance gains. Now, it's great that the Xbox One X can hit 4K, don't get me wrong, but usually developers are happy to drop the resolution somewhat in exchange for being able to increase other settings. Over a year ago, when I reviewed Battlefield 1 on the Masher Pro, I told you I was going to stop focusing so much on native resolution and more on actual image quality. Now, I know some of you are going to see this as me just making excuses for why the Masher Pro doesn't need to hit native 4K to match the Xbox One X, but keep in mind this is the same logic I've used for every game where the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X couldn't match the Masher Pro's resolution, and there's been quite a few of them. This is the first time the Masher Pro had to run a lower res, and most of the time it's the other way around. The defense I've always given to the Xbox One X and less to the PS4 Pro, because the resolution difference there is usually much more noticeable, is that the resolution might be lower and you can spot it during comparisons, but during normal gameplay you'll probably never notice. From my own testing over the past few years, I consider 80% resolution scaling to be about the point where you get the best compromise of performance versus visuals in your average game, outliers not included, and that's true on my personal machine as well. I routinely drop the resolution scaling by 10 to 20% to get closer to 60 FPS with my 1080 Ti if a game is particularly demanding. With decent anti-aliasing and occasionally some post-process sharpening, I think 80% res scaling gives you the 4K experience in many situations. This is true of the Masher Pro and Far Cry 5, and that's why I went with very high settings, 80% resolution scaling, and locked at 30 FPS. There's one more major component of the graphical settings that evens the playing field across both platforms, and that's temporal anti-aliasing. TAA combines information from several frames to smooth out jaggies at the expense of sharpness. It is odd that Ubisoft chose to use TAA on the Xbox One X at native 4K, since there wouldn't be that many jaggies to start with at that resolution. On the Master Pro, TAA is helpful to smooth out some of that resolution drop, although the image does soften up a bit. When you're not moving, TAA does look nice and sharp because of course the previous frames look pretty much just like what you're looking at now, but here is the Master Pro at very high settings using SMAA, which is the other anti-aliasing option the game provides, and this is showing the difference between 80% resolution scaling and native 4K. Native is of course sharper, but you see all those hot spotting jaggies? TAA does a great job of smoothing those out, as you can see now. All that's changed is the anti-aliasing method. TAA is softer at both native and scaled resolutions, but native 4K is still definitely sharper, at least when you're zoomed into 300% like I am here. When you zoom back out to normal and aren't moving, the difference is still there, as you can see, but it's less noticeable. When you're moving, the difference is almost non-existent, and that's my roundabout way of getting to my main point, which is the Xbox One X is running about high settings in native 4K, the Master Pro is running the highest settings and at sub-native 4K, and for all intents and purposes, the visuals and experience are the same as soon as you stop doing direct comparisons. But I know you guys are here for direct comparisons, so let's go ahead and do them. You've been watching the opening scripted sequence in the game, which is a handy way to make sure I'm showing you relatively identical scenes minus some dynamic weather variations. How different do you think both platforms have looked so far? Moving on to some other differences, the Xbox has had fairly good texture filtering, especially compared to traditional consoles. However, the Master Pro is a bit better at greater distances. The Master Pro looks like it may have marginally better textures available, but the lower resolution in TAA reduced their sharpness to the point where both platforms, again, look all but identical. The Master Pro has slightly stronger screen space reflections, which are the color casts left on the ground from the red building and the skin-colored cast on the gun from the player's hand, and of course there are many other examples of this throughout the game world. The difference between the Master Pro and Xbox is slight, so I doubt most players would notice. Similarly slight is the difference in water quality and water reflections. The Master Pro appears to be running a slightly higher setting in some scenes, but it's again only noticeable when you're still and you're looking for it, and most of the time, I promise you, you're not going to see the difference. It's odd to me that the Xbox One X is using TAA at native 4K. I would think that FXAA or a refined version of the PC's SMAA, or maybe like SMMA plus FXAA or something, would deliver a definitively sharper image than what's on display here, but perhaps the developers decided that this was the best solution. I do agree with the developers' decision to not worry about higher settings since they have little visual benefit, although it would have been nicer to see some improvements to texture filtering. So far, the Master Pro is at best matching the Xbox One X and is debatably behind given the resolution difference, but this is a shooter, so I'm sure many of you want to see how it'll do at a higher FPS. To PC-first gamers, the idea of playing a shooter with a controller can feel like taping oven mitts to your hands and then playing Operation, and I routinely get questions asking why I play at only 60 FPS when 144Hz monitors are a thing, and I get it. While I've never been incredible at shooters, I used to be pretty good using a controller back in the Modern Warfare days. Once I started playing more PC shooters with my friends, it was hard to be objective about using a controller for anything that required speed and was in first person. I still use a controller for plenty of RPGs and third-person games, and of course everything I play on my consoles. But if you've ever gotten used to the speed of a mouse and keyboard, it's hard to feel competitive with anything else. Not to mention the input latency difference between 30 and 60 FPS is huge. I don't say any of that to say you can't enjoy Far Cry 5 with a controller, but I am very biased towards playing these types of games with a mouse and keyboard, and to do that well, you need to be at 60 FPS at least, which isn't an option on the Xbox. At 1080p in very high settings, the Master Pro does manage 60 FPS. However, you can see that GPU isn't anywhere close to stressed and the CPU usage goes all over the map. Even though every core isn't maxed out, I believe the CPU isn't quite good enough to lock at 60 FPS all the time. But the frame rate is high enough and consistent enough that it's a good experience and much improved over 30 FPS. Likewise, at 1440p in high settings, the Master Pro can also maintain 60 FPS in many situations, but with more drops down into the high 40s and mid 50s. Situations like these are pretty much the main reason why variable refresh rate monitors are a great purchase if you can afford them. On a regular 60Hz monitor, you will notice the inconsistent frame timing, but on a mouse and keyboard it isn't bad. To put it another way, a little inconsistent and around 60 FPS will frequently feel better to a lot of people than a locked 30 if you're playing a shooter. Of course, a lot of that comes down to preference, so what do you think? You can see the inconsistency at times in the PC footage, so does the added frame rate make up for it to you? The Master Pro is at 1440p and 60 FPS on the left, and the Xbox is at 4K and 30 FPS on the right. I'll zoom in a bit so you can see more of the resolution difference, and then back out. The Master Pro isn't exactly crushing every scenario, I'll be the first to say it, but it gives you a lot of options and flexibility that you don't get with the Xbox One X. I think your definition of which platform wins this comparison will come down to your preference in controls and frame rate more than it will visuals and resolution. If I was using a 1080p or 1440p screen, the Master Pro seems like the obvious choice. On a 4K screen, the Xbox might be the better choice if you don't mind 30 FPS. Some of you are probably going to interpret this as an automatic win for the Xbox One X, seeing as it's doing all of this at native 4K and the Master Pro isn't. It's absolutely an impressive showing for the Xbox, and while I don't enjoy most shooters with a controller anymore, I'm glad Xbox players have such a great console available to enjoy the game. A big thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon. Check out the Potato Masher and the PS4 playing Far Cry 5 when that video releases in a few days. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video, and let's continue the conversation down in the comments. Have a great day!